welcome everybody. We will get started. I was just giving everyone a couple minutes to get into the room. So thank you so much to our panelists who are here today to talk about ethics and finances around the pandemic and what newsrooms are doing to survive and hopefully thrive during this time. First, we will start with that newsrooms are being asked by readers to drop paywalls for their coverage of this crisis. What do each of you think are the main factors they should consider before doing so, or if they should do it at all? Maybe we could start with Sara.
Hi, thank you so much, Kathleen, and thank you everyone for having me and for listening in. I think one of the trends that you're seeing is that readers understand that it's a public service to get free access to information around the virus. But at the same time, newsrooms have to consider what this means for their business. And so you're starting to see some newsrooms put the paywalls actually back up, because while they want to be able to provide critical services to readers, it might impact their subscription businesses. The biggest example of this last week was McClatchy. McClatchy, which has over 30 newsrooms around the country, said that they're going to start putting back the paywall up against coronavirus news because they can't let it at this time, this critical moment, impact their subscription business.
Great, thank you so much. Kelly, what do you think are some of the factors that newsrooms should be thinking about right now before they make this decision?
Well, so you have competing loyalties here, right? You have your mission to serve the audience. And then you also have your loyalty to your business model to stay open and stay alive so that you can serve the audience tomorrow. I think it's a false dichotomy to see those as mutually exclusive. What we've seen in some newsrooms is actually, even though they have opened up the coronavirus content to all customers, all audience members, they've also been able to message that mission and get both subscriptions and contributions to their work. It's hard to do A/B testing on this, and I'm not even sure it's ethical to do A/B testing on this, but I think that you have to consider as a business play whether you are better off letting people access it because they need the information, and then asking them, and whether you would be more successful that way than walling it off and not letting people have the information, trusting that they will find a way to pay you for your service. I like the approach that says, let's make it free and then let's push really hard to get people to give us some money. But I recognize that not everybody has the resources to do that even. And that is, I think, one of the tragedies of the circumstances that we're in right now.
I agree. Those small newsrooms, they're struggling, I think, a lot more than the bigger ones with more diverse investments.
Well, and it also has to do with the level of, most of these newsrooms pay a vendor to provide this service, and the less you pay, the less flexibility you have on your ability to put some content outside the meter, and then also to message around that content. You almost need a little bit of development help in order to do that, to customize the system.
Great, thank you. Tom, are there any other factors you think that newsrooms should be thinking about right now to help them get through this pandemic?
First off, it's not an either-or binary choice. What we're seeing a lot of newsrooms do is, even if they've raised back up the paywall on some of their coronavirus coverage, they tend to be leaving the real-time news, breaking news, down free, which and then the more deeply reported content is what is going behind the wall, which is a lot of it. But that sort of real-time, quick, here's the latest feed is something that everybody can still get. And that's a pretty logical set of tactics, because that allows you to provide that public service to people, but serve that coexisting need of trying to survive so that there is a day after the pandemic for your publication. Two other things that I think are worth noting. The need to raise the paywall is increasing as advertising vanishes. And we'll see this roll along with the pandemic. The collapse of advertising is associated with social distancing. So the longer that continues, the longer that local businesses won't need a newspaper to advertise in, because they have no functions. Whether that advertising comes back or whether that this is just hastened a secular change that was going to happen anyway, we don't know the answer to that. The other thing that's happened, and I think this is really also a very positive development. One of the problems that newspapers have had for the last 15 years is that as they have made their digital access available to subscribers, a lot of subscribers have never registered for that. So older print readers tend to prefer the paper in print. And the survival of local publications that are subscription-based will depend over the next 6-7 years on their getting rid of print. I mean, I believe the future of newspapers, if it has a future, is printless, or 1 day a week print. So you have seen papers like the Minneapolis Star-Tribune use the crisis to urge their subscribers successfully register for digital access, which you have already paid for and have never taken advantage of, because we don't know if we'd be printing a newspaper in a few weeks. And you've seen papers like the Tampa Bay Times that indeed have pulled that switch pretty quickly and have, I think, gone down to 3 days a week. Kelly would know the answer to that, but that's a pattern we're going to see. We've seen in a number of places, and this is a way in which you begin to get people to do things and do things yourself that really you should have been doing 5, 6, 7 years ago.
Can I follow up on a quick point, which is one thing we're seeing, and Tom made a good distinction here, is what kind of journalism is going to go in front or behind the paywall. And one thing I saw with the McClatchy announcement is, as we continue on with the coronavirus, the journalism around it has changed. Obviously, we still have critical services, telling people where they can get critical goods, which stores are open, which schools are closing, and what resources are available to them, as well as health precautions. That's still critical services. But we're now seeing a lot more journalism that's think pieces, it's analytics, it's what's the economy gonna look like a year from now. And I think the distinction you're gonna start to see more newsrooms take is, for some of that really important breaking news, here is where you can get food if you are in critical need, that will stay in front of the paywall. But some of the more analytical stuff, here's our economic think piece about the virus, is what will go behind the paywall.
That makes sense. So we are seeing a lot of furloughs and layoffs throughout, especially newspapers, more than radio or TV. So what are some other solutions that you guys would suggest newsrooms look at before making those cuts in staffing? Do you feel like there are other things we could be doing beyond that to really help us keep that staff and keep delivering the journalism that our communities need? Sarah, would you like to start with that?
Sure. I mean, we're seeing a variety of tactics right now. First and foremost, you're seeing news organizations ask their readers for money. Vox Media put out a note to its readers saying, help us with contributions so that we can still provide this critical journalism. The other thing I'm watching news organizations do is get creative with digital. We've seen live events that were canceled move to virtual events and webinars. Axios is doing a bunch of them, and they've been really successful for us. The other thing that we're doing is we're thinking a little bit more carefully, I'd say, about how we put out our resources and how we think about coverage. Obviously, everyone's getting big traffic right now. But can that traffic help to turn somebody into a loyal subscriber down the line? there are different ways that you can actually tap into your journalism to get someone to become a subscriber. And I think going back to that McClatchy example of keeping the stuff behind the paywall, that's really smart analysis, those think pieces, that critically important original investigative journalism, we're starting to think more about how can we produce that type of content, married to our breaking news content, of course, that's going to get someone to be a more loyal, either, for us, it would be a reader, but for another organization, a subscriber.
Great, thank you so much. Kelly, same question. Do you feel like there are some other options we should be looking at before making cuts in staff that lead to cuts in our coverage?
Well, everybody's looking at those options. And it's not, broadcast is not spared from this. They may have a little bit more runway, but they're not going to be immune at all. What do executives do? They look at all the expenses that could be cut, and they cut those first, right? So everybody's travel budget, everybody's marketing budgets, a lot of things have been cut. They go to staff last because they know that has the longest effect on morale, can affect the product at its core. So I'm not sure. I'm not going to sit here and say people are doing it wrong by any sense of the word, because it's incredibly painful. And if you look at when they're making cuts, people are making cuts because they have debts to pay. And they're making cuts because they're not going to make payroll if they don't make cuts. It's not like they're making cuts to satisfy shareholders. In most cases, they really are simply trying to publish another day by making the cuts. It's going to be very painful. Obviously for a newspaper, the biggest cut that you can make is the printed edition. And we're seeing that. And I think we'll see a lot more of that. But even that isn't going to be enough in many cases. And so we're going to see a critical breaking point fairly soon here for many local news organizations where there are no cuts that you can do to stay alive. We're going to see places close. So for those that are making cuts, it is a sign that is the last option that they have.
Okay, thank you so much. So Tom, maybe you can lead us on our next question. Can you give us some examples of newsrooms you feel are balancing their paywalls and coverage well, or examples of what newsrooms are doing differently that you think are helping them through this time?
Well, one of the things that we're seeing, and everyone that we've talked to has seen it in their data, is that service journalism is what readers are responding to. The things that are getting highest engagement are the things that can really help people live their lives. I think that on balance, this is connecting, there's a couple of existential threats to local journalism. One is that you are not relevant, you don't understand your community, and you're not providing them with information that's valuable to them to help them navigate their lives. This crisis has, at least for the moment, reconnected a lot of these publications. They're doing things that are really essential, that are not fancy, and readers are responding to that. One of the questions is, will you be able to understand as your readers' interests shift? Will you be able to make that shift with them? How close are you to them? There's also an appreciation in this moment of what journalism provides to people, and you can see that in not just increased subscriptions and donations and the other, and more engagement. Everyone's numbers in terms of engagement are up, but can you turn that short-term need into a long-term relationship? That really is going to depend on the quality of the news organization. And to go back to the question you just asked a moment ago, if to accomplish one need, your financial needs, you gut the news organization so that it can't provide any real value, then you're not going to have much of a future anyway. The other element to this is that for the last 15 years, our notions of community as people all over the world has shifted. Community has become an abstraction in a lot of ways. I'm interested in baseball. My community are other baseball fans. I'm a yoga person. My community are yoga people, or I'm a quilter, and I'm quilting with people all over the world. And as the internet, as that ability to define community as a community of interest has grown, interest in local news as a geographic reality has diminished. We've seen that. I saw that for 16 years when I worked at the Pew Research Center. We just saw gradually the interest in local news begin to decline. And part of that also was because we used to get our national and international news through a local publication or a local broadcast. So we thought of that as local news, even though we were getting the full range of news about the world through those outlets. This moment, this crisis, has redefined our definition of community, not entirely, but refocused it more around geography, around our civic life, what our governor is doing, what our mayor is doing, what the rules are for me to live versus getting this virus, and which hospital would I go to, et cetera. Again, the question is this a relationship that you are building, or is it just a need you are filling at the moment, in the same way that, I go to the hardware store 20 times while I'm working on a home project, and then I don't go again for 2 years.
Okay. Sara, same question. What examples do you think of newsrooms that are doing this well, or that other smaller newsrooms could learn from right now?
Yeah, well, one of the big challenges here is that for local news, branding and marketing was never a part of their playbook. And in part, it's because there wasn't much competition. For a lot of these hyper-local outlets, they were the only game in town. If you look at national outlets, they've had to invest heavily in branding and market differentiation because they had a lot of national competitors. And I think one of the opportunities about COVID is that you can create a value proposition in this moment that's going to force people to come to you and come to you only. And what Tom was saying was interesting because, if you were a local outlet that was providing, especially for the broadcasters, syndicated national and international news, you were no longer a unique value proposition for the person in that jurisdiction. What's going to stop them from going and getting that same international syndicated news from a cable network or from a broadcast network? Now is the time for them to really tap in to what they and only they are able to accommodate and provide. Things like school calendars, updates on plans in town, which streets are being closed, which are not. That type of hyper-local service journalism is, I think, what everyone needs to really be thinking about right now in order to create a lasting value proposition long-term, but also for one right now. The other thing I'll say about local news, and Kelly touched on this point before, is how can you reimagine your products to make sense for this time? People are scared of print right now, which is wild because there have been multiple studies that show that the virus does not transfer well on print paper, let alone cardboard, but people are scared of it right now. So how can you reimagine your products to make sure that they're fully digital? We talked about webinars and live events. But are you thinking about things like podcasts? Are you thinking about things like newsletters? We know that the quality is not going to be what you had imagined, but that's the type of thing that newsrooms need to be pivoting to, and pivoting to quickly.
Great. So that actually kind of leads us into our next question. For smaller newsrooms that want to provide that hyperlocal coverage, like street closures or different hours on their grocery stores or pickup businesses, do you suggest any specific tools or resources that they could be using to start building that coverage for their communities? Sara.
I didn't know if you were coming back to me.
Yes, sir.
I think CrowdTangle is an excellent tool. It's a software platform that Facebook bought a few years ago, and it's now made for free to local journalists. It's called CrowdTangle for Local. And what it can help you do is mine what's going viral on social media in your jurisdiction to help you get really smart story leads. So for example, if a lot of people are tweeting that the town is out of toilet paper, you've got your A1 story for the next day. But you really need help mining some of that social coverage, especially if you don't have the resources to pay for something like Data Miner or one of the most sophisticated tools. Look to things that are free, like CrowdTangle, things like TweetDeck that can help you sort out what's happening locally in your jurisdiction.
Great, thank you. Kelly, same question. Any tools or resources that you would suggest for newsrooms who are trying new things to deliver this information to their communities?
Pardon the product plug here, but we have a guy at the Poynter Institute, Ren Laforme, who this is his whole job, is to sort through all the digital tools that are available to journalists and to make recommendations. So, I mean, I think I don't recommend using tools for the sake of using tools. I prefer that you identify a need and then figure out which tool is the best tool to solve that need. And so you obviously have to be listening to your audience really well. I do know that Hearken is a really great service that helps local news organizations, started by Jen Brundell when she was at WBEZ, helps local news organizations listen to their audience and identify ways of serving them. I really like the product that I see coming out of the use of that tool because it's super responsive and it allows you to customize your answers. When we specifically talk about COVID-19, I think that one of the things that every local news organization needs to do, and I don't see all of them doing this right now, is you have to provide county by county information to your audience, because it doesn't do anybody any good to know how many cases you have in your state. You really need to know what's happening in your county. And then I think you need to further customize that information by getting information from the hospitals about what the how many available beds there are, because that's really critical information that is unique to the geography that you live in and is going to inform you if you have to make a decision about if you're sick now, what you're going to do, even if you're not sick with COVID. Like if you're having a heart attack, you want to know the answer to that question. So there are several, including Johns Hopkins and the University of Maryland, who are putting together maps that are amassing some of this data county by county. I am telling every local news editor that I can get a hold of that, like, please use those services. They're making that available to you. And if you're not passing that on to your audience, you're missing an opportunity to give them some of the most relevant information in a really digestible form. And then when you provide the additional context to it, it helps you as a consumer recognize where your geographic area is on the curve. So I think that this crisis is an opportunity to start thinking not just about the story globally or nationally or even on a state level, but how is it affecting your audience and how do you distinguish your work from other people in your state that are serving different audiences.
Great, thank you.
There's a couple of other tools. I mean, there's a lot of them out there now on how to listen to your audience. Ground Source is an interesting tool that much like Hearken. And some news organizations have turned to solutions journalism so that you're not just listening to your audience in a general sense and surfacing their questions, but solutions journalism and that frame helps you identify things that people are doing in the community that are already about solutions that people are coming up with. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution just converted its editorial pages, its opinion pages, to being solutions journalism focused. And that's something that the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel did about 2 years ago, where you are, instead of taking positions on issues locally, you are identifying ideas that people in your community are working on to solve problems in the community.
Great, thank you. So next question is, are you guys witnessing any new revenue models or experiments that just popped up in light of the pandemic that you feel like have caught your interest and you're following to see if they work? Is there anything new popping up? Sara, would you like to start with that one?
Absolutely. So there was a trend that we saw during the impeachment trial where newsrooms started to create pop-up products solely around that topic, whether they be newsletters or podcasts. The same thing is happening in coronavirus, but I think this moment will solidify the trend moving forward. First, a lot of newsrooms are adopting technology, processes, and talent to create pop-up products. So in the future, when we have a crisis or we have one story that dominates the news cycle like impeachment, they're going to have the tools and resources to very quickly create specialized products. One of the differences, though, that I'm seeing between COVID and I saw during impeachment is that because we're starting to realize that this is going to be a really long thing, we're starting to create video and TV around this topic. You're seeing short-form COVID-19 video shows that are popping up on streaming platforms. You know, I've heard about shows that are being planned for some of the big streamers like the Netflixes and Hulus and Quibis of the world around this virus specifically. That's a really great revenue opportunity. And one of the interesting things about COVID is it's truly a local story. If you wanted to really dive into what's happening in COVID, you're going to want the small, teeny local biweekly that covers Queens or New Rochelle, New York, because that's where it's getting really serious. You're going to want the Seattle Times because that's where it started, and we're starting to learn from the data about how it's going to spread. So there's opportunity for local journalism in video and even potentially streaming or television deals. We're also seeing local broadcasters, by the way, coming up with coronavirus programs and hours specifically on the virus. Lastly, we mentioned a few of these before, but they're also helpful things for local to keep in mind. Again, virtual events, they're easy to set up, they cost very little to produce, and they can be highly effective. Same thing goes for things like podcasts, specialized newsletters, specialized sections on your website. If there's a thirst for this content, create a product around it. And I think eventually, when advertising does start to come back, you're going to find that it's easier once you're able to set up specialized products to capitalize on specialized markets moving forward.
Thank you so much. Tom, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I mean, first off, I think there's a little bit of a dialectic here in that if you try and exploit the crisis for money, that's pretty queasy inducing. And so I think there's a fine line. Publications and programs have to be careful that that doesn't look like they're monetizing the illness. It's a little easier for broadcast where you're creating special, if it's advertising subsidized, because you're not asking the consumer for money directly, and you're leveraging whatever audience you develop. It's an older model and it's more indirect. That's not going to be, that may be available in the podcast model, which is still ad subsidized. But you know, newsletters, if they are not paid newsletters, are a bridge to your larger publication. I think the other question, and we've actually got it in a chat question here from Damon Kiesau, is you develop more sophistication about acquiring email through newsletters and asking people to register around your COVID coverage, and then you reach out to them later in a less direct way, and I mean in a more direct way. You email them and talk to them about supporting the publication. But new products that are COVID specific that you would monetize, there's a limit there, I think, to how far you can go.
Yeah, I think the other problem is the challenge to local on many of those new products is products don't scale on a local level the same way they scale on a national level. And so you can see places like the Atlantic, which Damon mentions, they have much more opportunity The history right now of local products like podcasts is that it's very difficult. Tom may know, but I don't know of anybody who's actually turning a profit on a local podcast. Maybe a sports one in Boston or something, but I don't think you can replicate that very easily. And I definitely don't think you're going to do it around COVID, because if you think about what you need in order to turn revenue around a local product, you need a sales team in place. You need a runway to do it. So I like Tom's idea of simply understanding the funnel and making really good use of it, knowing exactly where your customers are in the funnel and developing a deeper relationship with them, because there might be an opportunity down the road. But it's really hard in local right now to think about products that are going to throw off any amount of meaningful revenue.
And I would just add one other thing to that. This was the dilemma and the fallacy of the hyper-local strategy that went through the local news business 10 years ago. And that is that it's almost as expensive to cover a city council meeting that's got a pretty limited audience as it is to cover big things that have a very broad audience. And so there was this notion in the business, let's just cover things that are purely local, very local, that no one else can replicate. While there was some logic to it, the economics of it didn't really make a lot of sense. You actually needed to look for things that you could develop real expertise around that could have potential an audience larger than your market. That's why a Boston Red Sox podcast can potentially be profitable, but or Notre Dame sports. But it becomes pretty difficult if you're purely local. You really need to be urgent to your. You need to have a model that I think of as sort of 5 or 6 things that make you essential to the community, rather than just a series of silos.
Great, thank you so much. So is there anything that newsrooms should be thinking about long term? Like, if this vaccine takes a year for us to get and we're in social distancing and having these issues for the next year, I know a lot of newsrooms are thinking about directly what's in front of them, surviving day to day now. What do you feel like journalists and newsrooms should be thinking about if we're in this situation much more longer term than we hope to be? Sara, would you like to start with that one?
Yeah, I think, well, more macro than just the journalists, but the organizations themselves may want to start thinking about partnerships, ways they can leverage resources long term. There's some great nonprofits out there that are doing good work. Obviously, what's happening, across like the Lemphis Institute, for example, Report for America. People are trying to help out local newsrooms right now. So if you're not already having those conversations, you should be having those conversations. And then I'd say from a reporter perspective, I'm not a local journalist, I'm a national journalist, but I've been in very close touch with some of my other colleagues from other outlets about ways that we can share resources and help one another. I think normally journalism can be a hyper-competitive time, but this is the time to start thinking more about public service. And so if there's anybody from maybe another regional paper and the two of you can share resources, thinking about those types of things, this is the time to do it.
Thank you so much. Kelly, do you have anything to add to that?
I second what Sarah's saying about partnerships. I think those are going to become more vital on the local level. You got to start talking to, commercial television needs to be talking to public radio, needs to be talking to local newspapers, need to be talking to weekly newspapers. If you think about the democratic need of the community, it does not make sense to be duplicating resources in a time like this. And so figuring out how to share resources so that everybody's covering the local police department and the local municipalities. The other challenge in many markets is that when you have local areas, like for instance, the market that I'm in, Tampa Bay, you have a hard time covering any sort of local government because you really are targeting the entire area. And so figuring out ways to develop partnerships so that you can spread that burden around so that there is local accountability journalism, I think would benefit the audience. And I feel like if you do that, and then you tell the audience that you're doing that, and you tell them how vital it is that local journalism survive. I love your dog, Kathleen. Then I think, oh, come on, make the dog come up. I think then, I think you're at least marketing your message and your mission to the audience and asking them to vote and to say whether they are going to support local journalism or not.
Kathleen, I think there's another dynamic here as well, which is that there's a misinformation and disinformation dynamic to the pandemic. There are some people who want to believe, for whatever reasons, that there are cures out there, that it's safe to do certain things that other people think are not. And so there's another motivation for partnership is to ensure that information that's true is not blotted out or drowned out or is competing too much with information that's false. One way of doing that, I think the 3 commercial television stations in Detroit actually created what they call in TV language a roadblock, where they all carried the same town hall rather than competing. When you do that, then anyone who turns on commercial television in that town is going to see that town hall and get the same information, get accurate information. So some of this is not just so you can cover more things. Some of it is so that you can make sure that the public in a moment of real emergency has information that's accurate, and that is knocking out the things that they might see in social channels or somewhere else that's rumor or misinformation.
Yes, I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we're facing right now. I'm on Twitter a lot and I see a lot of that misinformation. For newsrooms that aren't used to dealing with this level of rumors and anecdotes and misinformation that's out there, do you guys have any advice for them on how they can really battle this beyond saying, we're the source of facts? Is there other things that they can be doing to really try to get that out to their readers and viewers?
Oh, I do. So the International Fact-Checking Network, which is headquartered at Poynter, has, these are fact checkers the world over. And because the coronavirus took root outside of the United States first, those fact checkers actually have followed the curve of misinformation. So there is a resource of more than 1,000 fact checks, and it's been all translated into English, and you can search it by keyword. And if you go to Poynter, you should be able to find that. You don't have to reinvent the wheel, right? Like this is a problem the world over. And if somebody else has already done a fact check, that we have licensed that for anybody to use. And so that is available to you. And so you don't have to chase down stuff that's already been fact checked by other reputable sources. And these are all people who have been certified, if you will, as signatories to a code of ethics around fact checking. So their work is good and verified.
Great, thank you. Sara, was there anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, 2 things. I like that Tom made the distinction between misinformation and disinformation, because one of the biggest challenges here is not necessarily that people are putting out tons of disinformation, which is, things that are not fact intentionally, but rather misinformation. People are posting things that they truly believe to be true, especially around some of these cures that are being peddled, even at the highest ranks of the administration. And that can be incredibly dangerous. And so I'd say that's one thing that local newsrooms should be very aware of is the fact that their audiences might be contributing to misinformation. That's one thing I would say that you can help do is take to your social channels to have direct communication with your audience. If you see misinformation around the specific topic that's being perpetuated over and over, that might be a topic that you want to address with your audience so that you could debunk it. Going back to what Kelly said about the International Fact-Checking Network, there are a lot of resources still being put into it. I know Facebook has just donated more money to make sure that ICFN continues to do its great work, IFCN. And I think that, if you can tap into those kinds of fact-checking resources, at this point, they're plentiful. Developing those partnerships, that can help you go a very long way.
Great, thank you so much. So I know that there are a lot of negative effects of this pandemic on newsrooms right now, but all of you touched on a little bit that they might learn to collaborate more and share resources. Do you guys see any other positives coming to newsrooms from the current situation, things we're learning or other types of collaboration between us that you hope will last into the future after this is over?
I'll take that real fast. We've seen a lot of third parties start to consolidate government information. Local NYC is a really good example of this. They're taking all of the really great tools and resources from credible, authoritative voices like Johns Hopkins, the CDC, and the NIH. They're putting it into databases and they're taking out parts that can be localized. They're hoping to move to other cities, and especially prioritizing cities that have been hit really hard by this pandemic, New Orleans, Detroit, etc. I think if you can find ways to help consolidate good data and sources of authority, that can be a really good and helpful thing for local newsrooms to think about sharing.
Great. Kelly, did you want to say something?
Well, I mean, I think Tom's point earlier was a good one. One of the good things is this is accelerating some of the changes that local news organizations need to make in their business models in the first place. I also think that it is accelerating the really intense focus that you have to have as a local news provider. You cannot be all things to all people. That is just not an option anymore. So you really have to decide what are the core things that you're going to cover and improve your content strategy and your reporting strategy. And so a lot of things, it's going to be a lot easier to get rid of some of those extraneous things now than it was 4 months ago. I guess the last thing that I think is a good thing that's coming out of this is the relationship with the audience. People are desperate for information about what even more than 9/11, this crisis affects everybody directly. Like if it doesn't affect your health, it's going to affect your economics. And people are desperate for information. And we've always known that local audiences trust their local news providers more. I'm hoping that what we're going to see in the research is that those relationships are deepened and broadened as well. And so I think those are three things.
So I'm both a skeptic and an optimist on this. And the note of skepticism is people have put aside all kinds of institutional differences for the moment because they have to. You see mayors and governors working together. You even see, to some degree, the federal government and governors working together. Those long-term institutional rivalries and needs to compete and even try and destroy each other have not gone away. They have been temporarily set aside. And so some of these things that beset us before are going to return. The other thing is that the needs that we have are already shifting. This was entirely a story about how bad is it going to be, what's going to happen. Social distancing was new. What are we supposed to do? There was a lot of basic information that we needed to acquire, and we were very eager to acquire it. Now we know how to wash our hands. Now we know what social distancing means, et cetera, et cetera. And as this crisis eases, our needs for immediate breaking information will probably subside to some degree. Not everything will be new. And that will mean that these news organizations are going to have to do a somewhat higher level of quality of news to meet my needs. And my desire to go visit them hourly may subside and become daily, and they may become semi-weekly. So the news organizations need to shift with that. I will say that some of the lessons that, on the optimistic side, some of the lessons that news organizations are going to learn about how to accelerate, how to rethink coverage, how to scrap sections of the paper that you've had for years that make no sense now. Some of those things are how to understand your audience data better. Some of those things are lessons or muscles that will help you along the way. But not every good thing that we see is going to be lasting here. Jack Howard has a question in the chat, which I think is worth noting, which is he's curious about paywalls. He's noticed the New York Times will lower some paywalls if you give them your email or setup account. Can you talk about paywalls and those kinds of what he calls compromises? So the key for one of the most important things for a publisher is to get someone's email. If I can get your email, I can communicate with you directly. If I can register you via email, I can understand who you are across devices, what we call persistent login in the platform world, right? And one of the things that bedevils publishers in an advertising world, we like to think that we like to have unique visitors. Even though one person might be 4 unique visitors, we like to triple count people because it made our audience look bigger. In a subscription world, we actually need to know who's a person and what their behavior is across their devices. So it's not actually the broad number that I care about. It's your behavior and it's the quality of a user, not just how many users I might have. So Jack, the reason that you want to get someone's email is so that you can begin to understand their behavior across devices, offer them newsletters. Newsletters are the single most valuable way to convert subscribers. So it's a coin of the realm. That's why I am willing to drop the paywall for you on certain content if you'll give me your email, because then I can begin to have a relationship with you and you're not an anonymous device to me.
Great, thank you. There are a few questions about paywalls. Damon also asked, how are local media improving the sophistication around the optimization of paywalls during this crisis? So some are lowering the walls, some are collecting emails. Are there other ways that local media is changing or optimizing their paywalls to adjust to what's happening right now?
I can take that. I mean, we saw about 2 years ago, Google made adjustments within search to first click free, so that basically it used to be with Google that the first click was free, but then paywalls would automatically go up. Now we're seeing more flexible paywalls based off of how often you're visiting. Those used to take technology that was very, very sophisticated. And so only national publishers could really leverage something like that. Meaning that if you were coming to their site 5 times a day, you're going to get prompted to pay because they know that you're hyper interested in their content. Now, I think the big tech platforms, particularly Google, are making it easier. They're also doing distributed marketing with some of these local publishers so that you can help run some of your own ads on your site through Google that prompt you to get a subscription or become a subscriber if they see that you're visiting more often. And so I know right now it can be also a very difficult time to be thinking about partnerships with some of the big tech platforms because sometimes, you know, you're feeling competitive with them. But I actually would really heavily recommend to have those conversations with the search engines or the social media companies where your side door traffic is coming through about ways that you can create more flexible paywalls to optimize and sort of push those people who we know are really hyper interested in your journalism to finally make a switch and maybe potentially pay for it.
Great, thank you. Kelly, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I mean, I know that a lot of the smaller publishers are really frustrated with their vendors, and that they can't seem to get the flexibility that they need, and they don't have the internal development resources to provide that flexibility themselves. And so I think this is a problem that that if you have any sort of scale, you have a lot more flexibility to address it. So whether you're part of a chain or even a consortium, and so if you find yourself at the wrong end of that equation, rather than trying to do things yourself, I think you almost got to find a buddy, right? You got to find either a professional consortium or some way to start having that conversation, because those are, you can spend a lot of time and money on this problem and not get anywhere. And if you don't have a lot of expertise answering it, I would say don't try and start answering it yourself right now. Go out and find some help.
Thank you. Tom, did you want to add something?
Only this, and that is that if the platforms and tech companies wanted to help, really help, and not just promote themselves, providing solutions for something like this would be more valuable than some of what they're doing. It is tragic that local publishers are struggling with these issues that, this late into the game, and this crisis is an example of an opportunity for people to step up. We're seeing a lot of grants, small grants for publications to, keep their Report for America reporters, or or keep some reporters on staff, and that's valuable. I don't mean to denigrate that, but we have been spending we've spent a lot of money, millions of dollars in this disrupted industry, buying a man a fish and not teaching them how to fish.
I completely agree with Tom's point. I think that one thing we're noticing is, as what the techlash has kind of advanced, I think a lot of these technology providers recognize that the, buy a man to fish versus teaching a man to fish is going to impact them reputationally and fundamentally. And that's why you're seeing some of the platforms trying to make some of these incremental changes. You see Facebook is hosting these local media accelerators where they're bringing people together to figure out how you make money off of things, not even off of Facebook. Again, I noted that Google's made some changes. They said last year that they're going to prioritize the original breaking source of news. I mean, you're seeing, I think, and Tom, correct me if I'm wrong, I think one of the sources of frustration is, one, some of these efforts just came too late. They came to a point where local news publishers said, great, you're providing these resources, we're already almost out of the game here. And I think the other problem too is they're just not going far enough. It's one thing to teach a man to fish. It's another to teach him how to fish, how to fillet it, how to cut it, how to serve it. And I think at this point, we need a lot more to be done from some of these platforms, because let's be honest, the majority of traffic, digital traffic, at least for websites, and as Tom mentioned, we're cutting out print at this point, it's still coming from these side doors. And so if the side doors can help local really figure out how to make money, how to monetize, how to use their tools better, that would go a long, long way.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, I think their efforts to these companies are run by people who are they're run in such a way that they are so solipsistic that the efforts that they make to help local journalism also help the platforms. And if they don't serve that dual purpose, they really don't do them at scale.
So beyond the tech companies, I've seen things from like ONA has been emailing out about these community circles and other resources like that newsrooms can get involved in. Have you guys seen other resources beyond Facebook and Twitter that newsrooms can turn to right now that might help them build out some of what they need to be doing with their communities? Sara, have you seen anything like that?
Well, I was going to say, I mean, in terms of organizational support, yes, you have a lot of journalism trade groups that are offering resources right now. The one area or the one thing, and this is a little bit different answer to your question that I've noticed, is for the first time, lawmakers are kind of taking this a little bit seriously. I was shocked when Mitch McConnell signed on to be a co-sponsor of the antitrust bill for the newspapers last year. We had a few other Republicans, Rand Paul, obviously Senator Kennedy was one of the senators instrumental to introducing it. But we saw 2 days ago, Senator Richard Blumenthal got 24 senators on board for an ask to Congress to create a special carve out for local media in the next stimulus. And it's a pretty big carve out. It's basically saying, I want you to direct most of your government advertising into local. I want you to make it possible for newsrooms that are really tiny but part of big consortiums to be qualified for PPP, that payment program for smaller businesses. And I mean, I don't want to say too much, but we have reason to believe that you're going to, start to see Republicans start to jump on board because they are, for the first time, willing to put some of their political differences aside and prioritize this. And we also know that it's making some momentum in the House. And so this is not exactly addressing your question about what can you find from them to partner with organizations that are like nonprofits, but there is, and I fundamentally hope there could be some government assistance along the way. And I mean, we've seen some efforts by states. New Jersey allocated $5 million to local news last year. But if we can have a really robust government response in the next stimulus, a carve out for local news specifically, it would set a tone for lawmakers that this is truly a bipartisan issue that we need to tackle. And I'm going to just be honest, it hasn't been that way for the past few years, especially as Congress has gotten more gridlocked. So that would be a major, major step.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, Tom and I have had this conversation many times. So there's a difference between a one-time support or a limited support and then some sort of sustaining support. And I'm the industry itself. I think that they're almost there, but I wrote a column a couple of weeks ago, and I got a lot of pushback about whether the industry is really at the point that they're going to accept any sort of government sustaining support, or whether that's even a good idea, whether you can still be a watchdog. We obviously see it in many other countries, but it's been something that's been absolutely repulsive to the industry until this moment. So I'm just not sure where that's all going to go. And I think the difference between, I think that unless it's sustaining, the industry needs to be sustained at this point. And unless it's sustaining, any sort of one-time bailouts are going to kick the can down the road a little bit, but they're not going to change the ultimate reality. Even if they're really big bailouts, local media is on the ropes. And the other thing is that for local television in particular, they haven't been on the ropes until this moment. And then you look at just like what happened to political ad spending, which just literally like a faucet shut off at a moment in a year when they thought that that would be a sustained growing source of revenue over the entire year. We don't even know what the local broadcast industry is going to look like in 6 months. So I think there's a lot of questions there and not a lot of answers, both questions about the ethics and about the whether the industry is ready to accept that.
Just to follow up to that, to clarify my point, what I mean by this being a more sustainable effort moving forward, because I completely agree with you, is that I think Republicans, especially in Congress, have been allergic to any sort of thought process that's going to intentionally help local news. There's no reason that a newspaper antitrust bill shouldn't have been able to have been passed. At this point, a lot of Republicans are now on board. It was a political problem. And so what I hope coronavirus can do is tear down that political barrier of thinking of, for Republicans at least, helping local news as being some sort of, political no-no. If we can get to a point where this helps bring bipartisan support for the issue, then maybe it's a government thing, maybe it's a government mandated third party, I don't know what it is, but maybe we can figure out a way where no longer it's supporting news and local news a partisan issue. That's kind of what I was hoping and trying to get at here with this being a sustainable step, at least on that government side.
I mean, I think there's some dimensions to this. One is a government assistance comes in many forms, and the notion of a sort of federal bailout or grants is one thing I think publishers are hesitant about. But the notion of postal rates or deeming news organizations as essential services, or recognizing that public notice advertising should go to local media and not just be on government websites, or even saying, let's make sure that some percentage of, and maybe a large percentage of the government advertising around the pandemic should not just go to national media, but should go to local media. Those are all ways in which government can recognize the essential quality of local media. That's not a bailout, or in the sense of General Motors 2009 bailout. The other thing I think, the other dimension to this is the notion that what we consider on probably everyone on the panel, and maybe everyone who's listening, thinks of as traditional or professional or mainstream media, that is somehow liberal media, particularly in the local level, where you have one primary newspaper in every city and a handful of TV stations, or maybe no TV stations because it's so local. The notion that there's any economic incentive for those publications to be political, to be politicized or partisan, is insane. They cut off half their audience if they're doing that, or if they live in a conservative community, they cut off 3/4 of their audience if they do that. This is, there are problems with newsrooms and problems of bias, but the notion of some kind of, that traditional media is a partisan media. The Republican Party needs to move beyond that, or it will kill local media, and democracy will be weaker for it.
All right. Well, thank you so much. That's all we have time for today. Thank you, Kelly, Sara, and Tom, for joining us. Such a great discussion, and we appreciate your time so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.